Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. My name is Geertje Baars. I'm one of the co-directors, together with Maas and Susanna Santos, of the Center for Law and Social Change here at the City Law School. As a center, we try to promote research, scholarship, debate, discussion, teaching, and learning of an actively feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial nature. For that reason, we organize a number of events with interesting speakers like the one we have today. And I will introduce you to Santosh. So Santosh Anand is one of our PhD students attached to the center and working at the law school on international criminal law, taking a third world Marxist and third world Marxist Twale-inspired perspective on international criminal law and international law more generally. Santosh will be introducing our speaker, and our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then Santosh will give some commentary for discussion, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. We have it's a rainy day today, so we have a lot of people out on the Zoom with us, and so anyone on Zoom, if you'd like to ask questions, we'll be reading them in the chat, and we'll be responding to them, and we can ask them during the Q&A as well. So I'll hand over now to Santosh, and I'll go and sit down on the other side.
Thanks, Geertje. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have with us a very distinguished speaker in Professor Mohammad Shahabuddin to talk on an important subject of decolonizing minority rights discourse. Professor Shahabuddin is a professor of international law and human rights at the Birmingham Law School, University of Birmingham. He is an author of two important books. First of these two books came out in 2016, and it was on ethnicity and international law, histories, politics, and practices. It was published by Cambridge University Press. And the second and most recent of the two books came out in 2021. It concerned minorities and making of postcolonial states in international law. Now, the work of Professor Shahabuddin is informed by critical postcolonial and third world approaches to international law perspectives. So his work has generally been anchored in the tradition of anti-colonial thought and praxis. So in light of that, we couldn't have hoped for, I believe, a more appropriate speaker to talk to us about decolonizing minority rights discourse. So on that note, I will invite Professor Shahabuddin to share his reflections, and then he'll speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then I'll share a few comments to start us off for a general discussion and Q&A. Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you so much for this extremely kind introduction, Santosh. And my first and foremost thanks to the Center for Law and Social Change for this extremely kind and generous invitation, and also individuals behind the center and also taking all the trouble of organizing this kind of events. So my good old friend Geertje, Susanna, and of course, Santosh. The title of my talk is Decolonising Minority Rights Discourse, and it has almost become a trend to talk about the kind of the decolonizing project, and we have been hearing of this decolonizing theme for some good years now. So I'll talk about that later, but also it is important that we also keep in mind the broader context which inform my research in general. The idea that colonialism is, of course, not a matter of the past. It continues to transform and shape our thinking, our worldviews, and our everyday life. in many profound ways. And if you need a very kind of a solid example in this regard, the ongoing struggle of the people of Palestine would be a very somber reminder of that everyday experience of colonialism. Now, let me begin by citing the British delegate during one of the sessions of the UN Human Rights Commission at the time in 1953. During a discussion on the proposal to include a minority protection clause in the draft International Human Rights Covenant in 1953, the British delegate made the following remarks. I quote, "With the march of civilization, certain backward groups would in the course of time become assimilated, and it would be undesirable to insert a minority protection provision in the draft covenant, which would oblige states to delay that inevitable historical process of assimilation," unquote. These comments captured the general mood of the time regarding minority protection. Terms such as civilization and Christianizing, the anthropologist James Scott writes, I quote, "strikes the modern ear as outdated and provincial, as euphemisms for all manners of brutalities. And yet, if one substitutes the nouns development, progress, and modernization, it is apparent that the project under a new flag is very much alive and well," unquote. So far as international law is concerned, in the last many decades, TOEL, which is Third World Approaches to International Law, scholars have demonstrated how colonial connotations, such as the standard of civilization or the presumes incapacity of the colonized to govern their own affairs, continued in more subtle forms to inform, shape, and govern current international law and institutions to the disadvantage of already marginalized communities. Beyond these critiques and intellectual elucidations, however, calls have been made more recently to proactively look into ways in which colonial legacies can be undone and how colonial links can be delinked, if possible at all. In other words, the agenda now is to put critiques into action. One of the key focuses of this important decolonizing project is on the domain of knowledge production. Started in South Africa and symbolized by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement swept across academic institutions in the West, including traditionally elite ones, which directly benefited from colonialism and the slave trade. Similarly, Decolonizing Museums movement not only demanded the return of historical artifacts to their rightful owners in former colonies, but also sought to recognize the integral role of empire in the creation and maintenance of museums. Scholars in a number of academic disciplines, including ones in core sciences such as mathematics, also took up the project of decolonizing their respective disciplinary practices. At the same time, critical voices have also been raised questioning to what extent decolonization is possible within existing structures, or whether the project is yet another whitewashing tool. In the midst of this debate and in this continuum, minority rights scholars are also gradually engaging with the decolonization question with renewed rigor and exploring what a decolonizing project in the field of minority rights would look like. And it is against this backdrop that in this paper, I attempt to unpack the decolonizing agenda in minority rights discourse and map out what such an agenda would entail. Here I specifically focus on the term discourse because to think about decolonizing minority rights, it doesn't make any sense to me yet because you don't really know what that project would look like. So therefore, I'm more interested in the way we talk and think about minority rights to begin with. And in that sense, the primary audience of this project was fellow scholars who work on minority rights and minority protection sort of jurisprudence, and to expose and to engage with them in a kind of self-reflective way to see how we can think about the decolonizing agenda within the discipline. Now, borrowing from Foluke Edibisi, I use decolonization here as a collection of strategies and trajectories whose boundaries are delineated not only by the manifestations of the specific colonial manifestation contested, but also the structural and epistemic tools of contextually available. Thus, the decolonization project entails a series of interconnected activities and purposes of seeking to fundamentally unseat colonially produced structures or coercive power and technologies of permanent dispossession and dehumanization. Translating this conception of decolonization into minority rights discourse then reveals at least two major avenues to explore the nexus between decolonization and minority rights. And these are the following. First, the formal decolonization processes affecting minorities. The second, decolonizing minority rights discourse. Now, in one of my monographs that Santosh has kindly mentioned, I have explained in quite great detail about this first part, which is what happened to minorities as part of this formal decolonization process. And in that work, I explained the postcolonial state itself as an ideology, meaning a set of ideas and meaning that create and sustain an asymmetric power relations, but at the same time, it has the capacity to gloss over, to justify that asymmetric power relations, and to maintain that hierarchical relationship. Using the postcolonial state itself as an ideology, I talked about three ideological manifestations of the postcolonial states through which the state then marginalized minority communities. The first of those ideological manifestations was the ideology of the national state, in which, in the name of national homogeneous identity, the state becomes the majoritarian, which eventually suppresses and oppresses minority aspirations. The second ideology was the ideology of the liberal state, where in the name of equality, non-discrimination, and the liberal egalitarian principles, minorities are perpetually locked into an asymmetric relations where most of their welfare issues are left at the mercy of the majoritarian political elites. And finally, the ideology of the developmental states, wherein the core idea of development works as a legitimizing factor in suppressing minorities, whereas minorities suffer the most in these so-called developmental activities in the terms of land grabbing or natural resources exploitation. So using these two ideological modes of operations, the post-colonial state creates and sustains an asymmetric power relations, but at the same time justifies that asymmetric relations in the name of national unity, in the name of equality and non-discrimination, and in the name of economic development. But today, the main focus of this talk is going to be on the second part of this nexus between decolonization and minority rights, wherein I'll specifically focus on this decolonizing minority rights discourse. While both aspects of the nexus between decolonization and minority rights are equally important and somewhat interrelated, in this talk, I will specifically, as I say, focusing on the decolonizing aspect. I will try to highlight two core components. First, the relations of power, and second, the importance of paying attention to subaltern voices and resistance. Now, mainstream discourse on minority rights embodies a series of normative biases and assumptions which ignore the colonial underpinning of some of the core concepts, such as the definition of minority to begin with, and also the notion of minority protection. In this paper, I would argue that the contemporary minority rights discourse needs to engage closely with relations of power and subaltern minority rights, subaltern agency to decolonize conventional thinking within the discipline. And I unpack this decolonizing agenda and map out what such an agenda would entail by critically analyzing 5 key areas of relevance, and that is going to be the main part of this talk, which is, of course, main part of the paper that I'm referring to. First, the very conception of the minority needs to be critically evaluated or reevaluated through decolonial lenses to expose a sense of otherness and backwardness embedded in the concept. A decolonial understanding of the minority brings to the fore the question of power relations and helps us problematize the notion of minority protection within the liberal legal architecture of minority rights. As part of this inquiry, I also analyze elements of subjectivity in the conceptualization of the minority and minority protection. I'll return to this point in great detail later. Second, the continuation of colonial boundaries in post-colonial states created and aggravated the minority issue in many post-colonial states. Therefore, unsurprisingly, a standard criticism against the decolonizing project comes in the form of an assertion that undoing colonial boundaries would cause more trouble than ameliorating minority situations. While there is at least some merit in this proposition, the decolonial project cannot be sensibly reduced to the issue of colonial boundaries as a stand-alone item. Instead, the decolonizing agenda requires a critical examination of the reification process of the state itself. Thus, in this paper, I engage with a much broader notion of decolonizing the state as a prerequisite for decolonizing minority rights discourse. And history from the minority point of view plays a key role in that part. Third, any decolonial project must pay attention to and engage with subaltern voices and perspectives. More specifically, the agenda of decolonizing minority rights needs to mainstream the often ignored aspect of resistance by minority groups. Going beyond an elitist discourse on minority rights and minority protection within institutional sites, the decolonial project demands a sharp focus on learning from grassroots practices. It is in everyday struggles of minorities to protect their lives and livelihood that actual decolonization is taking place. Their subaltern agency should, therefore, constitute the core of minority rights discourse. Fourth, like any decolonial project, the agenda of decolonizing minority rights needs to critically engage with the perception and role of law in minority rights protection. The project needs to reflect on how legal concepts and categories are themselves tools of oppression. This will then help underscore the strategic use of law as a site of contestation and also explore other possible languages of resistance, such as social movements outside the domain of law. These strategic aspects of law and their role in social movements should form an important part of decolonizing contemporary minority rights discourse. And finally, as postcolonial studies and TOEL have powerfully articulated, despite formal decolonization, neocolonialism and imperialism continue to subjugate minority postcolonial states and peoples in many ways. Developmental ideology historically offered an avenue to make such subjugation happen from the moment of formal decolonization. In decolonizing minority rights discourse, it is vitally important to take seriously the political economy of violence and expose how minorities suffer economic marginalization at multiple levels by powerful states, international financial institutions, post-colonial states, and national and transnational corporations. Compared to civil and political rights, this is rather an ignored area in contemporary minority rights discourse demanding adequate attention. It is to be noted here that the list of 5 key areas of relevance that I have mentioned, which I have also identified and elaborated in quite great detail in the paper, is by no means exhaustive. I hope my takes on these themes will provoke further discussion and enrich the field of research with more innovative thoughts and ideas. It also needs to be acknowledged at the outset that the project on decolonizing minority rights is not a singular act. Instead, it involves a complex web of activities and a wide range of actors. My talk today focused on various aspects of minority rights discourse, while leaving aside other significant aspects of this project, such as decolonial strategies for minority rights. An important part of this decolonizing project, therefore, is active listening and attentiveness to subaltern voices. Now, as I promised, and given the time I have, I will focus on the first of my 5 items, which specifically addresses the question of otherness and backwardness that is embedded in the traditional concept of minority and minority protection, and why it is important to reconceptualize the minority in relations of power. Any attempt to decolonize contemporary minority rights discourse should ideally begin with the concept of the minority itself, for the concept as conventionally understood is informed by a sense of otherness and backwardness and premised upon asymmetric power relations resonating with colonial discourse on the standard of civilization. This is largely due to the historical treatment of ethnicity as primitive and backward in liberal political philosophy and the dominance of liberal ideology in the aftermath of the Second World War. The assimilationist urge of liberal nationalism in the late 19th century had also recourse to an influential concept of the period, which is social Darwinism. Both monogenic and polygenic streams of social Darwinism, having the binding force of science, or so-called science, offered the logic of assimilation of different social groups within one political unit or their strict segregation on the basis of race. While the polygenists argued for the exclusion of the derogated other to preserve racial purity, the liberal monogenic framework went beyond being a mere parallel of natural evolutionary processes to rationalize assimilation as part of social evolution. And the comment by British delegate in 1953 that I started with is a classic example of that liberal mind frame when it comes to the assimilationist process for the derogatory other or the ethnic other. The social Darwinist scholarship indicated progress occurring through evolution, direction to social change, and teleology, an end which is built into social change itself. Given that this monogenic understanding of evolution was informed by the Enlightenment philosophies, unsurprisingly, all these concepts of progress, direction, teleology, in fact, related to the realization of a civilized society in the Western European sense. Thus, progress is exemplified by modernization. A modern society is a fully developed one that relies on modern political, educational, and legal systems, as well as includes a value system supportive of economic growth, in contrast to the traditional societies that largely depend on clan-based or autocratic systems of government, as well as pre-Newtonian science and technology. The same is also true for the concepts of direction and the end from the liberal point of view. It is therefore the vision of a culture through which progress would be maintained, and thereby the end, the teleological end, would be realized. Given that the high culture that would lead to the liberal progress is the selected European cultural traits in the social evolutionary process, everything else is arguably destined to submit to this high culture. This explains the logic of assimilation of the low cultural groups, such as ethnic minorities, into the liberal universal high culture. The 19th century concept of world civilization was translated into the theory of modernization in the early 20th century, and then into the notion of globalization in the era that followed. Nevertheless, in both cases, culture in ethnic, hence backward term, remained labeled as a barrier to progression. Culture was invoked to explain apparently irrational behavior and self-destructive strategies directed towards the attributes of advanced societies, such as development and democracy. This also explains why World Bank hired so many anthropologists to figure out why people in the Global South hate development and democracy so much. So the liberal anxiety is how to deal with the primitive ethnic phenomenon as it remains relevant to the pragmatic need of dealing with problems emanating, ironically, from ethnicity-defined phenomena such as ethnic minorities and ethnic conflicts. This anxiety is reflected in the definitional debates on the minority, as we will see. Difficulties in defining a minority within the liberal framework is obvious, in that the effort to define the minority represents an endeavor to define the indefinable, rationalizing the irrational. Formulating a general definition of a group that is identified by the centrality of ethnic affiliation essentially contradicts the liberal proposition that ethnicity has no real value and is relevant, if at all, only for instrumental purposes. Yet, as the liberal instrumentalist intuition dictates, the minority is a source of conflict. Hence, some form of definition of a minority is necessary to ascertain with whom to deal. As a result, a series of context-specific definitions of minority emerged throughout the history of minority rights discourse. However, the need for defining a minority goes beyond the mere substantive and procedural specificity that effective protection of the group in question arguably requires. Rather, this need for finding a definition is related to a process in which some groups are attributed certain distinct characteristics and thereby identified as the conservative other vis-a-vis liberal progressiveness. This ethnic notion of the minority then reflects back on the distinctiveness of the majority or vice versa. For example, in 1954, the UN Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and the Protection of Minorities defined minorities as, I quote, those non-dominant groups in a population which possess and wish to preserve ethnic, religious, and linguistic traditions or characteristics markedly different from those of the rest of the population, unquote. Special rapporteurs Francesco Capotorti and Jules Deschamps specifically highlighted the element of a sense of solidarity in their respective definitions of the minority in the 1970s and the 80s. The concept of otherness in the subcommission's understanding of the minority is translated into the subordinate position of the minority in a given society compared to the majority. At the same time, by wishing to preserve its distinctive characteristics as the insignia of its identity, the minority appears as a symbol of the 19th century's conservative tradition of defining the self in ethnic terms, which makes it different from the liberal understanding of the self as a non-ethnic or post-ethnic notion. The West is post-ethnic, right? But the rest is ethnic, therefore backward. In other words, this process of defining a minority can be seen as an ambiguous pronouncement. In one direction, it speaks of the otherness of the minority understood in terms of its ethnic differentiation from the majority. The converse of its otherness is the affirmation of the homogeneity of the majority. In another direction, it may speak to the liberal tradition by emphasizing the contrast between those who are committed to speaking the language of ethnicity in their self-identification and the majority who have dispensed with such a primitive condition. In this sense, the minority is not only the other of the majority within a given polity because of its distinctive ethnic features, but also due to its tendency to portray the self-image in ethnic terms, it is the other of liberal universalism itself. Therefore, the minority as a concept needs to be perceived in relational terms. It is in this asymmetric relationship with the majority in the realm of power relations and in terms of demographic composition and also liberalism at the ideological level, that the minority is consistently defined and understood as distinct as well as primitive. This then necessitates a critical scrutiny of the notion of minority protection within the liberal framework. Given that ethnicity turns the minority into the victim of oppression by the majority and also undermines the individual human rights of the minority group members, as the liberals argue, the liberal way of minority protection would thus logically mean the suppression of ethnicity through the individualist principles of equality and non-discrimination. In other words, the liberal version of minority protection appears as an emancipatory project. The liberal not only constructs the minority as a symbol of constructive passion, but also protects them from the curse of ethnicity, the very constitutive element of minorities. The liberal idea of non-discrimination assumes that a treatment on ethnic or religious grounds is fundamentally irrational. Hence, it undercuts the idea that groups should be protected on the basis of their ethno-religious features and solidarity. Within a liberal contractualist framework, for example, a minority is defined, I quote, a group of people who freely associate for an established purpose where their shared desires differs from that expressed by the majority rule, unquote. With such an approach, the minority as an association, it is the free desire of individuals that determine the nature of such an association. In this way, the argument goes, the reduction of a minority group to individuals or rational individuals is justified, as the argument goes, as it allows no question of protecting any particular culture. However, the problem with this position, of course, is that it fails to engage with what many liberals explicitly understand to be the problem, the link between ethnicity and violence, and assumes a position that tends to hide ethnicity by excluding it from the discourse, by not talking about it. The problem with the alternative position that they are alert to is that if there is this link between ethnicity and violence, then reinforcing it in regimes for minority protection may just end up affirming its value and importance. This is the liberal dilemma in dealing with the minority as an ethnic phenomenon. Seen through Foucauldian lenses, the liberal requirement that groups need to act in a particular manner to enjoy rights in a liberal regime essentially symbolizes a kind of power relations produced through a combined process of subjectivity and governmentality. Subjectivity sheds light on how the subject was constructed at different moments and in different institutional contexts, how the knowledge of the self is organized according to certain socio-political schemes, and also how these schemes are defined, valorized, recommended, and imposed. Governmentality, in Foucauldian sense, underscores a collective process involving institutions, procedures, analysis, reflections, calculations, and tactics that allow the exercise of the very specific, albeit complex form of power. In short, relations of power put in place a system of differentiations that permit one to act upon the actions of others to pursue certain objectives. Conventional attempts to define the minority and to frame minority protection squarely fit into this mold of power relations, as we have seen before. It is therefore essential to foreground the relations of power in decolonizing the concepts of minority and minority protection. While it is, how much time I have left?
10 minutes.
Yeah, should be fine. While it is generally accepted that the objectively recognizable fact of having ethnic, religious, and the linguistic characteristics differing from those of the rest of the population should be the starting point of every effort to formulate a definition of the minority. That's what we get from all previous attempts to define minority at the UN and also various scholarly level. The latest attempt at developing a working definition by the immediate past UN Special Rapporteur on Minorities, I think the definition was put forward in 2019, took rather an extreme approach by deviating from that objective approach and undermine the subject, by focusing exclusively on objective approach, on the features, and undermine the subjective element, the desire component, which was incorporated in some early efforts at defining minorities. And here is the definition, the latest attempt at defining the minority. I quote, "A minority is an ethnic, religious, and linguistic group of persons which constitutes less than half of the population in the entire territory of a state, whose members share common characteristics of culture, religion, or language, or a combination of any of these. A person can freely belong to an ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority without any requirement of citizenship, residence, official recognition, or any other status," unquote. Although the definition has a clear emphasis on free association, it focuses heavily on the objective criteria of elements, ethnic elements, and somewhat downplays the subjective element of the desire of the minority to preserve their objective elements. This approach is problematic for a number of reasons, especially if seen through decolonial lenses. First, with its almost exclusive focus on objective elements, the definition inadvertently adopts an essentialist approach to identity markers as self-contained categories. In the process, it ignores how, far from being fixed primordial categories, identities evolve and are constructed through ethnogenesis. Not paying attention to these nuanced processes of identity formation runs the risk of normatively locking minorities into fixed identity categories. Second, in addition to the transmutation of cultural identities, how one forms a knowledge about the self is also relevant to a critique of the definition in question. The knowledge of the self held by the subject of themselves is far from static and is indeed a product of evolving power relations. The above definition of the minority largely misses the point by assuming a fixed, a priori existence of ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities which a person can freely belong to. And finally, a more compelling issue here is the question of minority agency. The sole focus on the objective criteria reduces the minority to a subject of an automatic process of external identification based on those objective criteria. This takes the agency away from minority groups as to their own collective imaginations of their identity at a given time or in a given political context, factors which are in turn contingent upon a wide range of other factors. Seen through decolonial lenses, while the purely objective approach to the minority appears quite colonial as a normative phenomenon, it is indeed the case that historically identity labeling has been a common feature of colonial administration in many parts of the world. Thus, defining a minority based on objective criteria alone is prone to external determination and therefore problematic at many levels. Not taking seriously minority agency and the relations of power within which the minority is conceptualized, as we have seen in preceding sections, only adds to the limitations of current approaches to the definitional debates when it comes to the minority. As the preceding discussion on various attempts to define the minority reveals, what remains at the heart of such exercises is an iteration of asymmetric power relations of different forms, beginning from the hegemony of liberal worldviews, which identify the ethnic connotation of minorities as primitive, to a version of liberalism that reduces the question of minority identity to individual choices as part of the larger agenda of undermining precisely what forms the minority identity, but the liberal considers primitive and therefore irrelevant. And finally, to a formulation which takes minority agency away by subjecting their construction to external identification based on objective criteria alone. The ensuing concept of minority protection then evolves within this asymmetric power structure. Attempts to decolonize contemporary minority rights discourse need to reconceptualize the minority beyond the dominant vulnerability framework in existing scholarship, which conceives of the minority merely as helpless social groups in constant need of external protection. Within this vulnerability framework, minorities are generally understood as mere subjects of oppression. This, in turn, makes them the individual objects of international human rights discourse, along with members of other oppressed social groups based on gender, sex, or age that routinely face discrimination, but generally do not question the legitimacy of the state itself. While the traditional framework will continue to have its relevance, it is far from adequate to fully grasp the peculiarities of minority groups as political entities or to understand their particular needs within the society they find themselves in. The decolonizing project here calls for a new vision of the minority as an organizing element of the state. In this regard, rehistoricizing the state itself, essentially from minority perspectives, would demystify many of the suspicions around the special status of minorities within a state and make political and economic concessions to them more palatable to the broader society. A key part of this subaltern historiographic project should be to clearly demonstrate how the process of state making and border drawing left minorities behind and denied them their legitimate right to self-determination. Since the birth of modern statehood in Westphalia, at least as part of conventional international law historiography, whenever states have been reorganized, the minority question resurfaced in relation to the very political organization of the state. How to deal with the leftover population, that is minorities, who have been denied their own state. This underscores the sui generis nature of minorities compared to various other vulnerable social groups. This project of retelling the history of the state itself from minority perspectives is especially relevant to post-colonial states where the state-making process has been a hasty and messy affair. Another important and interconnected way of looking beyond the vulnerability framework would be to think about the minority as part of the global governance structure. Feminist legal approaches to statehood can be a useful tool in this aspect of decolonizing minority rights. Feminist scholars have called for dismantling the idea of the state as a homogeneous entity with a singular center of power, and instead appreciating the state as a complex network of interrelated but distinct institutions, relations, hierarchies, discourses, interests, and players. Such an understanding enables us to closely study the particular mechanisms of power within the state. Thus, and I promise that's the conclusion. Thus, having contextualized the minority in relations of power and underscored the importance of subaltern agency as part of the decolonizing project, this paper emphasizes the need for the reconceptualization of the minority by moving beyond the normative framework of vulnerability and victimhood, and instead by embracing a new vision for the minority as a constitutive element, the state as well as global governance. This is an emancipatory move in that it has the potential of redefining existing power relations vis-a-vis the majoritarian state and international institutions, thereby opening new avenues for asserting minority agency. My ideas on decolonizing minority rights discourse as presented in this paper are reflective rather than prescriptive. This can also be seen as an invitation to further research in this field, or at least as a conversation starter. At the same time, I'm mindful of the limits of such a project, given the hegemonic structure of global governance within which minority rights discourse are produced. I conclude with the hope that researchers interested in minority rights issues would be encouraged to identify and investigate other relevant areas of concern regarding the link between decolonization and minority rights in general, or to explore other more innovative ways of decolonizing contemporary minority rights discourse in particular. This paper offers a framework for systematically thinking about decolonial promises of minority rights discourse. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for that really rich outline of your entire paper in such a short period of time. I have basically two comments, and these are meant more as an invitation to further clarify and elaborate on some of the issues that you have already covered in this paper and the presentation. The first comment concerns this focus on discourse, decolonizing the discourse on minority rights protection. So you are alert to the limitation of such a project, and you acknowledge the power of the hegemonic global governance structures that provide sort of outer limits to what could be achieved within that hegemonic structure which produce these discourses, but taken on its own terms, on the term of just engaging with discourse itself. How do you think this exercise of decolonizing discourse would unfold, if at all, in a situation where we are constrained by these hegemonic governance structures? Do we have to account for those material struggles? You mentioned the agency of minority groups engaged in everyday struggle, effectively decolonizing in kind of different measure with their own hands, their own rights. Now, so my question to you then is, can the question of decolonizing discourse of minority protection, minority rights, can stand on its own even in a limited sense, unless we engage with the material sort of struggle, the question of political project?
Yep.
That's the first. The second one concerns with respect to your engagement with the category of minority. So you elaborately flag the internal inconsistencies and contradictions within it, and the liberal anxieties with respect to minorities. You also talk about the entire history of Westphalian sovereignty and statehood, and the need to rehistoricize that and tell us history where minority rights or protection of minorities is indicted in a history of the emergence of Westphalian sovereignty. So, but my question to you here is, in a project of decolonizing minority rights, where although we flag the internal contradictions and inconsistencies within the category of minority, do we also not run the risk of naturalizing that category by merely dealing with the aftermath of emergence of that category in a particular historical context? So, taking the example of the work of someone like Mahmoud Mamdani, who has provided a reconstruction of the history of emergence of Westphalian sovereignty. He, in that political history, he points out that minority is not a natural category. It has a historic emergence. And it is the linking of nation with statehood. The idea that every nation should have a state which created this entire category of minority. So in that sense, is there kind of sort of contradiction that way between different decolonizing projects, a decolonizing project which would kind of deal with the aftermath of emergence of this category within the historic but also contemporary frame of nation state, which, as we now know, not only exist in the European context, but also in post-colonial context. So is there something to be lost in just kind of confining a decolonizing project, which is concerned with dealing with the aftermath of the creation of that category and not really going to the extent of really sort of challenging this entire construct of nation state, every nation having a state of its own and a minority nation falling within its state boundary, therefore not sharing in the sovereignty that the majority nation would have, thereby creating this entire discourse about the need to protect the minorities and liberal anxieties vis-a-vis minorities and the group rights. But incidentally, the only group that liberalism is not anxious about is nation state. So that's broadly my comments. We can open up for discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Santosh. Thank you, Shahab, also for the fascinating talk. Would you like to reply to Santosh before we go to the room?
Yeah, sure. So not a reply per se, but I would like to extend what Santosh has more efficiently articulated. And I fully agree with both of your observations. And these are valid points. And the second one, especially, I face quite a lot. So after this heavy dose of critique, then you somehow are stuck with the definition itself. So I would rather try to flag some of the initial thoughts that I started with, why I took up this project to begin with, and who are my primary audience. So I was primarily speaking to a group of sympathizers who felt that something needs to be done about the way we think about minority, and decolonizing whatever project was out there was readily grabbed. So the idea was to spell this out a bit more and to see and to investigate what that project would look like. So the initial engagement was essentially, and that's how the discourse thing came up, with colleagues and scholars who are working and writing on minorities, but somehow finding themselves stuck within the given categories without really questioning the a priori assumptions about what the minority is, what the protection looks like, as if it is already out there. The agenda now is to how we can make it better, how many different treaties we can have, how many different provisions we can have. So my initial idea and intention was to make an intervention in that initial process regarding taking a pause, step back, and think, how do we actually talk about minorities? And we have been talking about it and what does that actually mean in real terms. And that is how the project was shaped. And that is also why the primary focus is on highlighting the importance of power relations and subaltern agencies and everything. And what you actually talk about, that might eventually become the future of which I don't have any clear vision or roadmap. And in that sense, the second question is also related and interconnected in the way that if the ultimate vision for the minority is to break with this given idea of the state as a fixed connotation and move towards to a more fluid understanding of global governance, or however hegemonic that might be, in the process, both the state and the minority as categories, as concepts, should also be redefined and re-articulated. So that might be the hope for the future, a future that is yet to born. But I also take your point seriously, that to what extent we can engage in that conversation, bypassing or avoiding the macro level of hegemonic global structure. Is it really possible to avoid that altogether while you talk about decolonizing the discourse or whatever? Maybe not, but I think it is more of a pragmatic choice of where you start from. And that also takes back to the first point that I was trying to make, is to give you the specific context and background why I took up this project and why at this particular moment. That's the best I can respond to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any questions, comments? We have a full Zoom room here, so anyone on Zoom wants to come in, let us know.
Hi there, I have a question. My name is Mahdina Shtipo. I'm a fellow at the McCain Institute. I'm also an alumna of the Irish Centre for Human Rights, where your work are being taught right, left, and centre, especially through Kathleen Kavanagh at my time. So I'm very interested in minority rights and your framework of vulnerability, because your idea is that we have to overcome this, right? So I'm a practitioner. I work a lot with like various minority rights, especially with religious ethnic minorities. And basically this framework of vulnerability within the context of ICL is what they cling on to, right? Yeah. They kind of, the fact that there is like atrocities being carried out very often by the state, against them, is kind of like really what they cling on to. So I kind of, from my perspective, overcoming that normative framework is really, I like the idea, but I struggle to kind of like, kind of the practicability of the concept, and how can we engage maybe minority rights, mostly through their leaders, right, to kind of like those who enjoy some standing within the community. How can we kind of take this concept and work with it like on the ground in the discourse with the minorities, with the minority rights leaders, to improve their situations on the ground? Yeah.
Again, this is also a kind of very challenging question that we often face. And so I specifically highlight in this paper that at the moment we cannot really completely abandon the traditional framework of human rights, because when it comes to minorities on the ground who needs protection on a daily basis, human rights is one of the things that they rely on, right? Adjudication or whatever reservation you might have about those, they do use those avenues, and that remains relevant for the time being. But I was trying to highlight the broader point about what we lose by following that vulnerability framework. And when it comes to translating that grand vision into practice, it is not just about minorities. That takes us back to the whole concept of human rights activism per se. How we practice human rights on the ground as a technical knowledge, as an elite project, why human rights travel to the global south in expensive jeeps, and why grassroots people are so isolated from that kind of elitist performance of human rights. So minority rights activism within this vulnerability framework will very much be part of that story. And unless and until we question that performative aspect of human rights, also minority rights, including minority rights, it will not really benefit much when it comes to actual practice. And that is also why I think it is important that we do not always start with, when it comes to minority protection, we do not always start with the legal avenues. Human rights has traditional resistance to social movements for obvious reasons. But if we really want to take that decolonizing project in terms of practice, I think that is the starting point. Thinking about minority rights outside the framework of rights or rights adjudication, that so-called very popular right-based approach that all NGOs practice in the global south. So I think that is what the project offers as potential when it comes to the practice, engaging more with grassroots agencies, their struggles, their movements, and mainstreaming those as successful examples of minority rights performance rather than following the kind of conventional trajectories. So that would be kind of like immediate pathway, but the story I'm offering here is bigger than that. It's more normative and theoretical in nature.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about minorities that are sometimes also majorities. So in the last few years, I guess we started to, here in the UK, you have the acronym BAME, Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic, and now we're starting to use the term global majority. And it's sort of even perhaps an attempt at decolonizing the discourse by using a different term to mean the same thing, but like that in itself might have a decolonizing effect, right? Because you have some minorities also in other contexts where you're maybe a minority in one state, but a majority in another state, which leaves you in a different position than a group that is a minority in one state and not majority anywhere else.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's absolutely true, and that's also why it has to be kind of context specific. And Santos's point was actually a valid one, that in many cases the whole idea of minority was literally imposed. Imposed, like the mandate system was a kind of classic example through which, like through Frenchman, there was a new book, not new, but a few years back, on how the whole idea of minority was invented as part of French mandate in the Middle East. So that is the case in Belgian Congo. The identity is like literally measuring people's skull and nose and height, like who is Hutu and who is Tutsi, for all sorts of strategic and racist reasons. Of course, minorities, that kind of things played a key role. And that is also why it needs to be context specific. But the problem of current discourse is so elitist. This kind of, we all know it, kind of like some UN level experts, or I mean, the word expert is very popular in the UN system. Like there are kind of official designations like expert this, expert that. I mean, who these people are? I'm one of them. For 2 consecutive years, I sat on the expert panel for UN Forum on Minorities. I was quite happy about it, but it's problematic. And also the institutional sides. So the vast majority of minority discourse is controlled by people like me, with the idea that we know it all. So it's kind of like human rights, it's a very technical knowledge, right? We know what is good for you, so we are going to deliver on that through advocacy, through this, and through that. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And I think when we talk about decolonizing the discipline, and that was my initial instinct, like how do you decolonize minority rights? What does that even mean? So my initial instinct was perhaps we can start with our own practices and see what we do wrong. And that is how this project emerged. And I am pretty sure there's so much left out in this project. So that's the invitation to other colleagues that let's take this project up and see how we can, in a self-reflective way, investigate our own disciplinary practices, our own everyday scholarly practices, and see where does all this elitist mind frame that we know it all come from.
Maybe I have a follow-up question. So I work a little bit on what some might call sexual minorities or gender variant minorities. And in that field, there is a real movement on the sort of materialist or Marxist side of things to do that historical materialist work where we look at how these categories have been haven't emerged, but have been created, like just like you were just saying, that this minority discourse, how it's being created, in what specific social economic context. So we're looking at like how in early modern and early colonial times, these categories of race and gender and sexuality have been created out of what were previously known as simply people with different preferences, or people with different practices, or people with etc. etc. And those kinds of research projects have then as their maybe to put it simply, as perhaps as a hidden agenda to undo that categorization in the here and now, in the today, and to go back to thinking of ourselves not as having a particular identity, but perhaps practicing one thing or another, or perhaps preferring one thing or another, and that being obviously not something that could happen without the material context or the material circumstances of people that have been labeled and categorized in certain ways, changing fundamentally and changing economically, materially, etc. But at the same time, that being the end goal eventually.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see the connections there. So they bring in the way that Santosh was also.
Yeah, and that has always been my kind of fascination when I engaged with minority-related research, not to just think about the kind of traditional way of, so you are having an international legal framework and you try to develop a national legal framework and apply it, and you have many case laws and jurisprudence and you make it better for the purposes of protection. I was more interested in understanding the bigger picture, like in how it relates to the very making of the state itself, both the post-colonial state, but state in general, and to think of minorities as a category as part of the global governance structure. And I think once we do that, it opens up far more possibilities of understanding this very intricate and delicate relationship between and among various other actors of the governance structure, and multiple layers of dominance and hegemony. And another point that I also highlighted elsewhere, also in the paper, that traditionally, when we talk about minorities, we speak in relation to the state being the traditional oppressor. But the ground reality of the 21st century, maybe for your practice, it would be more relevant. It's not always the state, actually. It's also corporations working in the global south, which are far more important. That's your field of research, corporations. So far more powerful than many third world sovereignties, which are also oppressive elements vis-a-vis minorities and their land and resources. And I think minority research minority rights scholar who are doing it. So, for example, Tom Lantos in Hungary, Essex University has a minority rights solidarity network. So there is some seriousness about this project, but it is at a very early stage. So you are unlikely to find kind of good amount of scholarship on this idea. But what the Tom Lantos Institute is doing, they are engaging with grassroots organizations and have started this conversation very much along these themes. But my note of caution to them has always been, rather than trying to train local groups and grassroots organizations in decolonizing the project, it would be far more productive and interesting to understand their decolonial projects already there for a long time, which we fail to recognize and understand. So that has been my note of caution to fellow academics and scholars who are interested in taking this agenda outside academia, with all good intention. But the point is, in most cases, we fail to recognize. So in the way, like the broader human rights story, as experts, we fail to understand the everyday practices of human rights on the ground, unless and until they speak back to us in our language, the language we understand, the polished technocratic language of human rights. So when it comes to decolonial project, people will resist when their land and resources are being attacked. They will do so. Right? It is our failure that we don't recognize that as a decolonial move. So that has been my invitation, that rather than giving this framework to people, we should have the openness to understand from their decolonial practices over a long period of time. That would be far more enriching, at least for us.
So we had a question from Zoom. This is a question from Lilia, who's a colleague of ours here, works minority rights. And it was, Susanna read it.
So if I remember correctly, hopefully we'll be in touch again, but it was about the UN archives, about USSR and Yugoslavia, and how can this framing of minority rights and decolonizing minority rights can help.
Lilia, we just tried to summarize your question, but perhaps let me unmute you and see if you would like to ask it.
Yeah, the question is here.
Sure. It's just mostly about the UN archives, and I was just looking at submissions from USSR and Yugoslavia, and I was just wondering, because I read your works, your book and your article as well, and I was wondering, how can we interpret this, their submissions and and kind of shaping of this discourse?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, that's a very interesting point. So if we go back to the Travaux Preparatoires history of both UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and subsequently two international human rights covenants, we see that Yugoslavia and Soviet Union specifically, they played a key role in pressing for the idea of minority protection. I've seen it myself in those archival materials. Now, so if your question is how one can interpret that, so to the best of my understanding, there was a seriousness about national minorities within the Soviet system, and they spoke quite strongly within the UN forum on a number of occasions. But at the same time, there was a serious level of evidence of oppression of religious minorities at the same time. So if you juxtapose these two practices and what was happening within the UN system, it would be difficult to draw any singular conclusion about the eagerness when it comes to minority protection in general. So whereas they spoke quite strongly for the protection of national minorities, and there were serious efforts to accommodate various national minority identities, religious minorities were kind of oppressed in a kind of heavy-handed way. So some bit of it would be strategic. Minority rights language was also one way of exposing the Western liberal hypocrisy and to expose the limitations of this kind of individualistic liberal notion of human rights. So it played out in different ways at different levels. Some bit of it is informed by domestic politics. Other bit is, of course, informed by kind of normative interest of engaging with the Western perception of human rights and the way it was exposed in a powerful way, I would say. So it's a kind of mixed bag. But when it comes to our individual research and the way we can use that part of the story of minority rights history, it would be more about our own framing and the kind of story, as we always do as researchers, what kind of story we are offering and to what extent that particular episode of the history of minority rights can advance our own narrative.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Super. Anyone else within Zoom or within the room right here? I was thinking about like minorities that become majorities. I know that, for instance, in historic Palestine, the idea of this kind of demographic threat that is described, that, you know, what we so carefully have tried to contain as a minority grows to the point where it's a majority, and that might be I don't know, a way I'm trying to think. I'm thinking a lot these days about like tables turning in the world. You know, I think tables are about to turn in the world, and that even those of us who are designated as experts or who designate ourselves as experts, etc., will be found to be at the end of the day irrelevant, and the conversation will be happening in a different place, in a different room, and we'll actually, yeah.
That would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
That would be a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Perhaps we're already there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, but
No, yeah.
yeah. True. I mean, that's an interesting point. And that has a lot to do with the future you were envisioning. But when it comes to the kind of majority-minority thing, there are actually good scholarship about how it plays out. So the general consensus among the kind of initial or early minority rights scholarship is that to become or to qualify as a minority, you have to be demographically small, and also you have to be less powerful in the domain of power, because there will be evidence, for example, in apartheid regimes, be it Israel, Palestine, or South Africa, like minority controlling over the majority. So that dominant minority will not be treated as minority. So it's numerically small, but it is not a minority because that is elite with all the power. For pre-independence Bangladesh, before 1971, the East Pakistan was actually numerical majority in terms of number, but power remained on the other side of the country. So that is another example. So you can be bigger in terms of number, but less powerful, or you can be small, but more powerful. And none of this will qualify as a minority in that sense. So to become a minority, you have to be kind of like smaller in terms of demography, but also in terms of power. Otherwise, it will create a kind of absurd situation. Interestingly, not this year, so December 2022, in the UN Minority Forum, there was a representation. There were like hundreds of minority organizations from all over the world, but there was a representation from an organization of white minorities. That was quite terrible. Maybe that's one example.
Oh, it's a bit like men's rights, isn't it? Men's rights groups.
Exactly. Exactly. So that was, I've seen it myself. So that was a representation from one NGO. At least one NGO, I don't know how many are there, but there was at least one NGO coming to the UN talking about minority rights of white South Africans. In Southeast Asia, that's a big problem. That's a kind of, again, the problem of 21st century. And that's what I'm saying, like, you have to be very attentive to these new realities in which we talk about minority, because things have changed. So market dominant minorities in countries like Malaysia, like Singapore, where Thailand, where you have less than 3 to 4% of national population, ethnic Chinese, who control nearly 95% of national economy. Literally all the banking sector, real estate, shopping mall. In the Philippines, real estate always remained to the few Spanish white families. But when it comes to other sectors of economy, banking, infrastructure development, heavily dominated by ethnic Chinese. So they are economically super powerful, but they face serious level of political backlash. Every now and then, ethnic Chinese businessmen will be abducted. And when their family goes to the police station, their family members saying, okay, people are asking for X amount of ransom, and police officers say, but you can afford it. So that's a kind of very new and tricky situation. So how do you talk about that minority? Minority, nonetheless, everyday victim of political backlash, nonetheless economically super powerful. And that also creates another layer of problem, because not all ethnic Chinese in the Philippines or Thailand are rich. Some of them are. So how do you fix this interconnection between? So it's a very complex situation. And that is also why it is becoming very, very difficult to discuss minorities unless you take the local context into account. It's becoming very, very difficult. There is a new wave of discussion regarding whether the diaspora community or like migrant workers who came like few years back, whether they should enjoy the same level of minority protection alongside national minorities, which is a very popular European category, which is not really that popular in other parts of the world. But in Europe, it's a big thing, national minority. So how do you reconcile that? So the Human Rights Committee, commenting on Article 27, they made it clear that it doesn't matter. Citizenship should not be a condition for minority rights protection, which created kind of like very long debate among scholars. In the Global South, there is another complexity, like how do you distinguish minorities from indigenous people? Indigenous rights is a very established field of international human rights law, very established. But unfortunately or fortunately, or however you see this, it's heavily dominated by the experience of settler colonial rule, especially USA, Australia, Canada, that sort of thing. And it has made serious progress. If you compare with minority rights jurisprudence, indigenous rights jurisprudence is way advanced. And as a result, many communities in the global south, they want to have that status of indigenous people. So in Bangladesh, for example, the Chittagong Hill Tribes, they see themselves as indigenous people, but the government refuses that legal status and accepts them as ethnic minorities, because that then brings them to a lower threshold of right protection. So no question about that sort of thing. In other cases, minorities are not even recognized as minorities. They are seen as kind of like illegal migrant workers. That would be the classic case of the Rohingya. But at another level, it's very difficult to make that distinction between indigenous people and minorities outside settler colonial experiences.
What about Sileti people from linguistic perspective?
So they can qualify as in terms of linguistic minorities, a kind of valid category. So another
they are very dominant, like they, you can say that they're rich, educated, and they have some good position. Even 5 of our Bangladeshi Chief Justice are from Sileti.
Yeah, but that would not be. So the question of identification then would be whether they want any specific protection when it comes to their linguistic identity, because minority protection is not something that you impose on them. Sileti case is interesting there because many of them would try to kind of speak in a Polish language when they come to universities or go for job interviews. And if that is something that the community wants, there is no question of minority protection because it cannot be decided. That is my argument about external determination of who is minority, who is not. Minority protection kicks in when the group itself demands that protection. So for example, if Sileti people, they want a school in their own dialect, and if that is what they need, then that would be a question of protection. If the government then forces them to give up that particular linguistic identity and then assimilate, which is definitely the case in the case of Chittagong. But if the group itself is more in favor of assimilation.
I don't know specifically. Do they actually learn Sileti language in their primary or secondary level?
No, so there is no such, to the best of my knowledge, that will belong to that case of the community, but it's more kind of oral practice.
But they have their written form, right?
I'm not sure about it.
They might have SOAS, there are some courses on Sileti language.
They might have, because it's kind of like in that part of the country, there might have some kind of ancient literature or whatever. But that from a law point of view, the test would be whether the group itself in question, because language is a accepted category. It might surprise you, because when it comes to international law and international human rights law, and when we talk about minorities, it only covers 3 categories. This is ethnicity, language, and religion. So sexual identity or orientation is not covered. So that will not be in this kind of very tight definition of minorities, which is again another area of serious contestation, why it has to be these 3. And that takes us back to the formative idea of why and how minorities came into being as a category. It has always been in relation to the state making and state making, and number 1, number 2, through European experience. And European nationalism, the experience of European nationalism is very much an experience of this linguistic, religious, and ethnic identity formation in relation to the statehood, and that's how these 3 categories. The outgoing special rapporteur gave a kind of a bit more expansive interpretation by incorporating sign language, because disability is also not covered in this definition. But he gave kind of general comment interpretation that linguistic, the sign language should be covered as part of the linguistic category. So that's the best you can go within the limits of these 3 categories. So yes, that's the valid category, language, but it depends on whether, because in some other countries, especially in Europe, Catalonia, for example, language is a big thing. The right to speak and use their own language. And that is fighting really hard for that. Russian language minorities in many parts of the Baltic and other East European countries, another big thing.
So cultural one is not included.
Culture is broadly defined within the idea of ethnicity. Yeah, ethnicity not being biological connotation alone, and that's why from 1970s within the UN we see a shift from race to ethnicity. Race as an idea became less popular, given its kind of very nasty past. So since 1970, you see a clear trend of moving away from the category of race and more reliance on the idea of ethnicity, because it covers both biological features, but also it expands other areas like culture, food, all sorts of things.
It's very difficult actually, very complex. I'm not an expert in minority.
I'm not either.
I'm just learning here. So you give the example of Chittagong Hill Tracts. I've been there in one occasion. It's called Raj Punna. That's kind of collecting the tax from the from their tenants, citizens of under one particular king. So I was like, wishing that I would see the king in their traditional dress. But what I saw over there, like the king was like this, wearing the suit, and like they are observing their cultural. It is kind of like on beards. They are observing this kind of cultural occasions, but cultural events. Right? Everything was like following their culture, except the dress of the king and queen over there.
They had traditional dress, but of course, it's for them to decide. So the Raja Debashishwa himself is a barrister. And it's not kind of unique. You'll find that kind of stories elsewhere. I also remember one of the former chief justices of Bangladesh. There was some violence against indigenous people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So there was a commission, and the commission, Justice A.T.M. Afzal, I think, if I'm not absolutely wrong, was part of that commission they visited. So the local community was quite excited about the visit. And after coming back, that's what he said. He said, we were greeted by some modern Bengali songs with guitar and everything. And we were given Coca-Cola as a drink. So that takes me to the point, like when we talk about minority and cultural issues in the 21st century, this neoliberal framework cannot be really ignored.
In 2013, I was in a training, in a military training, as part of our military training as a government servant in the Hill Tracts. So what I observed there, one elderly person, he was introducing around 90 years ago. He was introducing me that he is Buddhist, but his own grandson, he was introducing himself as the Christian.
Yeah.
So there are some missionaries within the Hill Tracts. They are that's converting from Buddhist to Christianity. So
in certain districts, again, I might be wrong. Yeah, so in certain districts, the conversion rate is nearly 95% among certain age group. And
so from a religious perspective, will they still be regarded as the minority if they convert?
So Chittagong, it doesn't matter, because even if they're Christian, they are nonetheless minority. But Chittagong Hill Tracts is more about kind of ethno-cultural connotation. So in that sense, definitely, but they don't see themselves as minority; they see themselves as indigenous people. But the broader question regarding Chittagong Hill Tracts, then not only conversion, like the Canadian and Australian colonial practices, I have seen it myself. Hundreds of young children are taken out from their families from Chittagong Hill Tracts, brought to other parts of Bangladesh, including my hometown in Jaipur. I've seen it myself. And they are being taught in missionary schools for hundreds of miles away from their home. And this is very much like Canadian and Australian boarding schools. As part of civilizing mission, you take children out of their family, and that is the way you civilize them. It is happening as we speak. And this is the kind of civilizational discourse, because the idea is the children of God, they need to be civilized, right? And we are the ones, the civilized. And it's not only just the Christian missionaries, the states are doing exactly the same thing when they impose the national identity, national culture, national language on them, because they see this as the way of civilizing the uncivilized. Because the whole idea of ethnic minority is informed by the notion that they are somewhat backward and primitive. And that's why they are in state. So the liberal idea, the idea of how you emancipate them from the curse of their own ethnicity. So if, from liberal point of view, if you talk about minority protection, a critical reading, the kind of reading I was trying to give, it is more about protecting minorities from themselves, from their own culture, from their own tradition, from their own history. That's the emancipatory project of liberal minority protection, to create an environment which offers all sorts of incentive for you to give up on your tradition. So you can be a French, but give up whatever identities and ideologies you might have. That's the price you pay to become a civilized French nation, because it is not, possible to reconcile your religious faith or hijab with our liberal ethos. Yeah, cool.
Very lovely discussion about Chittagong, and of course we know about the Rohingya, and kind of super interesting. I was wondering, because you mentioned the UN Minority Rights Forum, right?
Yeah.
And kind of those of us who followed, or there were a lot of like experts, the elite, so to say, right? Calling that it is time for minority rights to have, to quote, a seat on the big table, along, kind of issues like counterterrorism, the climate crisis, kind of issues of extremism, fighting extremism, kind of national food security, the really, really big issues. My question is, do you see that trend? Like, do we see minority rights being taken more seriously? Is there more debate around it? Is there more of a discourse with other subjects? I'm aware of the UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism, they're being very outspoken when it comes to Uyghurs in China, for example, what's happening to them. But do you see like other kind of connections towards like these kind of big areas when it comes to minority rights?
Yeah, not that much.
Not that much.
Not that much. And there are good reasons for that, why it didn't happen, because minority experts and scholars have not themselves explored these possibilities. And really, I've been, so in my submission on 2 occasions, I made the point of taking more proactive role in climate justice discourse, because if you talk about climate change, minorities alongside indigenous communities are at the receiving end. So in that regard, indigenous communities have actually done much better in terms of taking proactive roles in various other areas, as you have rightly said, climate change, food security. Minorities are very much stuck into this kind of civil political conversations and debates with the states within which they are. And also, unlike the indigenous communities, where the status has more or less been cemented through regional autonomy, and so minorities are still seen as a national kind of security threat to the state in a profound way. And that is one of the reasons there is such a kind of anxiety and ambivalence about putting them forward at those levels where states are primarily the stakeholder and they are the ones who are sitting around the table. I don't think there is a confidence for state parties to incorporate minorities in those conversations, precisely because of the fear that they don't want to present them as. Some countries don't even accept the existence of the minorities.
Constant struggle, right? Because they're seen as the other, and it's like, I think what you said about seeing them as primitive is like we see that pretty much everywhere in a lot of states with a lot of state actors. But you said there's a lack of confidence. So is there anything, I work a lot with like policymakers and I talk to a lot of diplomats and I'm like, is there anything we can do to strengthen their confidence, like in your opinion?
Yeah, there established research that shows us that more regional autonomy, and I mean, it's not suitable for every cases, but whenever it is, the idea is if you give and those concessions to minorities, there is a less likelihood of civil war. There established research by political scientists in that regard. So it's actually like what states do is actually counterproductive. And again, Bangladesh should be a classic example for that. It took 3 decades of bloodshed to come to the point that this is the right thing to do, and they eventually did that, which is a good thing to do. But not all countries always get that. So in your advocacy, that is something perhaps you can highlight, that actually making those concessions is a good thing because it makes the state more secure, not less. But I also understand why states are so nervous about making those concessions. And in most cases, it is about political backlash. And it has a lot to do with internal political engineering, the way, especially in democracies, the way voting pattern works. And Bangladesh will feel the story immediately. In India, even, how one religious group or ethnic group is seen quite close to a particular political party. So who is doing what, and it's very complex story. And in some other countries where army plays a key role, who see themselves as the vanguard of national security, right? They will be, yeah, exactly. So they will be very resistant to those political concessions. So in the case of Chittagong Hill Tribes, the concessions that was made out of a political deal, the CHT Peace Accord, a few months before the Northern Irish Peace Accord. So Irish one was in 1998. Chittagong Hill Tribes was in 1997, December 1997. But that is in a legal limbo. Because when the deal was, I mean, the ensuing law as part of the deal were challenged before the court, saying that it violated the fundamental rights of equality among all citizens. If all citizens are equal as per the constitution, how can you give preferential right to a particular group of citizens? Now, you can easily address this by giving specific constitutional guarantee that these groups are protected groups. Bangladesh constitution doesn't do that. So there was an overhaul, constitutional overhaul. After this legal dilemma, the government failed to do it. And the story that we know, there was serious level of resistance from the military. Now they don't want this because they think it is a clear and direct attack on the national political integrity, and that cannot be compromised. The country will be broken into pieces if we open that floodgate. That's kind of like, but the research tells us something very different. Research tells us that if you make those concessions, there will be less likelihood of bloodshed. And when there is bloodshed, you'll always find that solution was found as part of peace accord, precisely in those kinds of concessions. Look at Northern Irish Peace Accord. Look at Chittagong Hill Tribes Peace Accord. Look at whatever peace accord Mindanao. Whatever peace accord Christian Bale from Ireland, she did wonderful research on peace accords, and that is clearly the finding. But most countries would prefer to wait for the bloodshed to happen first before they sit around the table.
Yeah, exactly, you're right. And since I say that I was there as part of my military training, so we got the brief over there that why the military presence is necessary in that part and what they are doing for maintaining the integrity of the state, like settling the other Bengali people in that area, giving them land there and encouraging them to marry the indigenous people and just making them Bengalis rather than making them indigenous people. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and they have been doing this since 1971, right? This whole process of making them Bengalis.
Because there was a demand to make an autonomous autonomous entity?
So Chittagong Hill Tracts always enjoyed that status under the British rule and then under even Pakistan rule. It was completely taken away. So in Pakistan, there are different versions, but it was completely taken out when Bangladesh was created in 1971. The idea was everyone is equal citizen, everyone will become Bengali, right? It didn't work out. So this Ziaur Rahman's settlement scheme didn't work out. Ershad's didn't work out. And finally, the solution was found in Peace Accord, where there will be regional council and with some rights. So that's the story, but it took 3 decades of bloodshed to come to that point. People won't do the right thing unless there is bloodshed.
Okay, great. I think we've come up with time.
Yeah.
We could talk all day about this very fascinating topic. It just leaves me to thank our wonderful speaker, Mohammad Shahabuddin, and Santosh Anand for the commentary, Susanna for helping organize, and everyone else for coming, both in the room and on Zoom. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure having you.
Yeah, pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for your time and for engaging with me. Thank you. Thanks.
So much about you come back, and I know you're doing that.
Business. You. Keep saying we're hearing them.
Thank you. For reading the paper. It's a long paper.
Yeah.
No, but this is a very good site.